Well, I just wanted to start by saying thank you, Dr. Southall, and the conference organizers for putting on this virtual conference in an unprecedented time. Looking forward to telling you a little bit about my research on intercollegiate athletics, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the scholarship of some of my fellow colleagues as well in this virtual atmosphere for the College Sports Research Institute. So thank you all for being here today in a virtual capacity. My research as it pertains to college sports concentrates on sociocultural issues in the college football field. And the manuscript I'm presenting to you today is titled "The Division and Division II Football, HBCU Football Teams Are Disproportionately Penalized Relative to PWI Football Teams." And the present study analyzed the intersection of athlete, race, and cultural affiliation in the sport of college football, specifically Division II college football, and whether referees called a disproportionate number of penalties against football teams from historically Black colleges and universities relative to predominantly white institutions in Division II college football. And throughout the course of this presentation, you'll hear me use the acronym HBCU to refer to historically Black colleges and universities, and the acronym PWI to refer to predominantly white institutions. And this presentation has been structured to mirror the basic setup of a major research paper. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the introduction before we transition into literature review, unpack some of the methods for this study, highlight the results, and then talk about some elements of discussion as well. There are a number of different sociocultural issues or behaviors that are omnipresent in the sport of college football. Cultural affiliation with an HBCU communicates information to the referees. Cultural affiliation with a PWI communicates information to the referees. Players who aggressively grab or shove or trip other players during a Division II college football team are engaged in a form of nonverbal communication. Trash talking amongst players on the football field is a sociocultural behavior that's more accepted in some communities, less accepted as an okay style of play in other communities. High stepping, taunting, excessive celebrations, these are also sociocultural expressions that could potentially be called as a penalty by referees. And taken together, these sociocultural behaviors are often present in a game of college football. It was in the introduction for this study that I set the context for this research by talking about some unique sociocultural expressions and how they intersect with this notion or this concept of referee bias in order to lay an appropriate foundation for the current research. There was an article published in the International Review for the Sociology of Sport by Herbert Simons, which looked at race and penalized sports behaviors. And one of the arguments that Dr. Simons makes in this article is that athlete race and sociocultural factors can influence referee decision-making in the field of play. As Simons notes on page 5 of his article, quote, "There are a number of verbal and nonverbal behaviors exhibited by football and basketball players, such as trash talking, taunting, celebrating, dancing, that are penalized and heavily criticized by the athletic officials," end quote. And Simons contends that these types of behaviors are more prevalent in the African-American community and that these behaviors don't conform to what he conceptualized as normalized social behavior. He goes on to state on page 14 of his article that cultural expressions on the field, such as trash talking, taunting, and celebration on the field or on the court are, quote, "more penalized because they are abnormal or deviant from the accepted white mainstream norms of behavior," end quote. All in all, one of the more interesting conclusions that Simons reached in this 2003 article was the claim that African-American athletes on the football field and the basketball court are more comfortable enacting these types of sociocultural behaviors, but these behaviors are also more prone to be penalized by referees as well. Now, most sociology scholars would argue that good empirical research needs a solid theoretical frame. And for this study, critical race theory was employed because it illustrates or focuses on how issues of race are embedded into everyday society. And seminal work on critical race was born in the American judicial system and sought to illustrate ways in which racial inequalities were perpetuated in a race-conscious society. Most iterations of CRT, critical race theory, propose that positive change is predicated on identifying societal structures which marginalize individuals who have a minority status. And the passage of time has seen the fundamental underpinnings of CRT evolve from this abstract set of beliefs into a more parsimonious theory with some core tenets that center on matters of race. And it's within CRT that there are 5 tenets that really kind of outline how race functions in society. one of the central tenets of CRT is that issues of social injustice and racism exist with institutions and they're part of our everyday life. The prevailing kind of belief or thought process there, which underlies the first tenet, is that racism is ordinary and a recurring experience in society. A second tenet that most CRT scholars agree on is based on the interest convergence assumption, which asserts that being white is associated with a unique set of privileges that are not granted to minority groups. And this tenet suggests that the dominant culture possesses societal advantages and they have limited incentive to kind of reduce the privilege that they have. A third core tenet that underscores CRT is whiteness as property. Advocates for this third tenet of CRT contend that being white has value and is the ultimate property value or interest in society, according to CRT. Another tenet of CRT is that critical race scholars should engage in the process of counter storytelling to challenge accepted premises that marginalize those of a minority status. So being vocal, bringing attention to things that are issues is another tenet that is part of CRT. And lastly, most CRT scholars believe in a critique of liberalism tenet. The consensus within the CRT community is that liberals embrace a colorblind ideology as opposed to a color conscious view that could help ameliorate racist practice. Taken together, CRT posits that favorable treatment is likely awarded to Caucasian Americans, while African Americans and other minority groups are often subjected or can be subjected to racist treatment in a variety of different institutions, corporate institutions, educational institutions, and even within various elements of institutions of sport. There's a well-developed line of research that has found referee bias is a recurring phenomenon in a number of different sports. Empirical research on Major League Baseball by Kim and King in 2014 looked at over 750,000 pitches and found that Caucasian pitchers were more likely to have borderline pitches called as a strike relative to African-American pitchers. Scholarship by Parsons, Suleiman, Yates, and Hammermish in 2011 also concentrated on Major League Baseball and looked at called strikes and called balls from the 2004 season through the 2008 season. And their findings revealed evidence that, quote, when the umpire matches the pitcher's race / ethnicity, the rate of called strikes raises by 0.5% above the rate when there is no match. Stated differently, it appears the race of a pitcher can influence whether an umpire decides to call a ball or decides to call a strike on borderline pitches. National Basketball Association, NBA research has reported that referees call less personal fouls on players of the same race, according to Price and Wolfers 2010. And related literature by Tainsky, Mills, and Winfrey in 2015 examined 12 years of data from Major League Baseball. One of the things that they concluded is that white pitchers received the highest called strike percentages, and they also reported that black pitchers had a lower strike percentage call than white and Hispanic pitchers. Collectively, there's a good amount of empirical scholarship out there that has documented that referees call penalties in a manner that is not always free of bias. After all, referees are, at the end of the day, are human. They have biases and they can make mistakes just like anybody else. And that can happen during Division II college football games as well. That noted, there are a couple pieces of referee bias scholarship that are particularly germane to the current investigation. Closer to home on the college level, there's a well-developed line of research which is consistently revealing a penalty differential in college sports amongst PWIs and HBCUs within the field of play. It was on the baseball field in 2020 that Dix found home plate umpires were more likely to call a higher amount of walks allowed per 9 innings when the pitcher on the mound played for an HBCU relative to when the pitcher on the mound played for a PWI. Comparable findings reported by Dix in 2019 revealed that referees called more personal fouls against HBCU women's college basketball teams relative to the number of personal fouls that were called against PWI women's college basketball teams. That was found to exist in both Division I women's college basketball as well as in Division II women's college basketball. Seminal research within this niche by Dix 2017 found that referees excessively flagged HBCU football teams in the football championship subdivision relative to the number of flags or penalties that referees called against PWI teams in the football championship subdivision from the 2006 season through the 2015 season. And these investigations provide a reason to believe that HBCU student athletes will be disproportionately penalized within the sport of Division II college football as well. Therefore, the extant literature provides sufficient reason to offer the following predictions. It was hypothesized that a statistical difference would be uncovered on 3 different penalty-centric criteria in the sport of Division II college football. The first hypothesis looked at a range that went from 2013 to 2014 season through the 2019-2020 season, and suggested that referees will be calling more total penalty yards against HBCU teams relative to the total penalty yards per game that referees would call against PWI teams during that same period of time. The second study hypothesis focused on the similar span of time, the 2013-2014 season through the 2019-2020 season, and suggested that referees would call more total penalties per game against HBUC teams in comparison to the total penalties per game that were called against PWI teams. The third hypothesis suggested that referees would call more total penalties per season. So the hypothesis 3 is looking at per season against HBCU teams in comparison to the total penalty season that referees would call against PWI teams. And again, same date or range there from the 2013-2014 season through the 2019-2020 season. So the first couple of hypotheses concentrated on different penalty data that looked at penalties per game, while the latter hypothesis looked at penalty data per season. And the range of the 2013-14 season through the 2019-20 season was used in this study because that was all of the publicly available data that was accessible at the time this study was completed. Teams in this study were coded as an HBCU or a PWI based on their own self-description. That information on cultural classification was taken from hbculifestyle.com. It was then double-checked on the website for the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, to ensure that teams were accurately classified as an HBCU or a PWI. And now that you know a little bit about previous literature on the matter, as well as the proposed hypotheses, let's talk a little bit about how the data was collected. The data for this study was mine. As alluded to previously, the penalties per game during actual games by football referees were the focal point for this particular investigation. Once the data was extracted, it was imported into SPSS for a series of different statistical analyses. Some of the statistical analyses that were completed included conducting t-tests, z-scores, calculating means, computing standard deviations, and the like. And the process of completing these statistical tests also allowed for the calculation of p-values to determine if things were statistically significant at the 0.001 level, the 0.01 level, or the 0.05 level. Here are some of the results that were unveiled in this study. The first study hypothesis proposed that Division II college football referees would call more total penalty yards per game against HBCU teams in comparison to the total penalty yards per game that referees called against PWI teams from the 2013-14 season through the 2019-2020 season. This hypothesis was supported after an independent samples t-test was completed, in which cultural affiliation, either HBCU or PWI, was entered as the grouping variable. Stated differently, HBCU football teams in Division II encourage a larger average number of penalty yards per game than PWI football teams in Division II for the 7 analyzed seasons. The second study hypothesis proposed that Division II football referees over the 2013 through 14 season through the 2019-2020 season will call more total penalties per game against HBCU teams in comparison to the total penalties per game that they called against PWI teams. The second hypothesis for the study was also supported based on an independent samples t-test in which HBCU or PWI was again entered as the grouping variable. Put another way, Division II HBCU football teams exhibited sociocultural behaviors that resulted in a greater amount of penalties per game being called against them in comparison to Division II PWIs from the 2013-14 season through the 2019-2020 season. The third study hypothesis again looked at the same period of time, the 2013 through the 2014 season, through the 2019 through the 2019-2020 season, and looked at total penalties per season against HBCUs in comparison to the total penalties per season that were called against PWIs. Support was found for the third study hypothesis after an independent samples t-test was conducted in which HBCU or PWI was entered as the grouping variable. That is, HBCUs in Division II college football were subjected to having more total penalties per season called against them for their behaviors on the field relative to PWIs who competed in Division II football over the course of the 7 most recent analyzed seasons. Supplemental analyses were also conducted specifically on the first study hypothesis in the form of rank ordering the criterion of penalty yards per game for each individual team from the 2013-2014 season through the 2019-2020 season. These additional findings from the current research revealed that 48% of the 25 teams who incurred the most total penalty yards per game were HBCUs. This is noteworthy of mention because HBCUs represented only 14.19% of the entire sample for this investigation. Every Division II HBCU football team was above the mean average of 65.07 total penalty yards per game for the entire group of Division II football, except for the outlier of St. Augustine's University, which averaged 64.75 total penalty yards per game during that period of time. Lastly, it should be noted 6 out of the 10 most penalized teams by referees during this period of time were HBCUs on the aforementioned first criteria of penalty yards per game. The current study exposed a socio-cultural issue in that football teams from HBCUs were disproportionately called for penalties relative to PWI football teams from the 2013-2014 season through the 2019-2020 season. While one of the limitations of this study was that the data was collected in an indirect manner, there are a couple of key points to unpack in the study discussion as it relates to implications, as well as it relates to implications for previous research. The central findings from the study were that Division II referees disproportionately penalized HBCUs relative to PWIs over these 7 years with regards to total penalty yards per game, total penalties per game, and total penalties per season, as well as total penalty yards per season. These results validate previous research, which has found that HBCU women's college basketball teams are more likely to have personal fouls called against them, both in Division I women's college basketball and in Division II college basketball. This previous research also falls in line with this research also falls in line with previous scholarship from 2020, which found that on the baseball field, more walks than strikeouts were likely to be called against HBCUs relative to PWIs. And it falls in line with, again, the seminal research of Dix 2017, who found in the football championship subdivision, referees were more likely to call penalties against HBCU football teams relative to PWI football teams. So taken together, the current scholarship is the 5th piece of research, which has uncovered a statistical differential in penalties as it relates to HBCUs and PWIs within the field of play. Now, maybe the question that naturally arises out of this is, why are referees or have referees disproportionately penalized HBCUs relative to PWIs? And there are multiple explanations for why the current findings emerged for the study hypotheses in this investigation. First, one possible explanation, is that the accepted style of play for African-American athletes at HBCUs doesn't always conform with the established rules of the game. Research by Simons 2003 outlined how African-American athletes had what he called the cultural tendency to engage in nonverbal celebratory expressions such as dancing, high-stepping, trash-talking, which referees could call as penalties within the field of play. Those nonverbal expressions, as well as those verbal expressions, could be connected to the uncovered findings. Perhaps another possible reason, perhaps HBCUs in Division II college football over the aforementioned period of time were more accepting of those types of verbal and nonverbal expressions in the field of play relative to their PWI counterparts. That's certainly something that could be as well. So taken together, the communicative behaviors of trash talking and nonverbal expressions could be more prevalent and accepted at HBCUs relative to PWIs. But again, those are behaviors that are subject to penalty based on the referee's decision. Another possible reason for the uncovered findings in this study is perhaps less skilled athletes and resources may have contributed to the uncovered results. It's possible that less skilled athletes play for HBCUs relative to PWIs in the current world we live in. That could have been connected to possibly HBCU players transgressing the rules of play. And the notion that less skilled athletes may play for HBCUs relative to PWIs falls in line with the research of Bergman and Logan 2020, who reported that 5-star and 4-star athletes were more likely to attend BCS schools, which are PWIs, and less likely to attend non-BCS schools, which includes every HBCU in the country. Perhaps HBCU players do have less talented players who need to transgress the rules of fair play in order to be competitive with some higher profile athletes from PWIs. It's also conceivable that less resources at HBCUs, not as fancy player training facilities, less money to pay prominent coaches could be inhibiting the ability of HBCUs to attract highly skilled athletes. Collectively, the style of play at HBCU's talent level and resources are some possible explanations for the uncovered findings. But another possible factor, or something that should be noted, is that referee bias as it relates to athlete race and cultural factors influencing decisions is very common in the sports world. And that could be a factor. Athlete race and cultural factors could influence referee decision making. Along that line, it's possible or conceivable that an implicit cultural or racial bias was at play, as evidenced by the finding that 95.45% of Division II football players in the HBCU conference of the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association, the SIAC, identified as Black, and 90.11% of the Division II college football players in the HBCU conference, that is the Central Intercollegiate Athletic Association, identified as Black. In contrast, it's within the traditionally non-HBCU conferences in Division II football that only 40.85% of Division II football players self-identified as Black, according to NCAA diversity data. And these pieces of demographic data point maybe towards an implicit cultural or racial bias, but it cannot be pinpointed as the main culprit for this study, again, due to the indirect nature of this investigation. Those claims would certainly fall in line with the CRT, some of the main tenets of CRT, but it again should be reiterated that the indirect nature of the study makes it difficult, if not impossible, to conclusively ascertain why a statistical difference was observed on these various penalty-centered criterion for the current investigation. Additional research at the intercollegiate level could provide more insight on the findings that were unearthed in this study of Division II football. It will maybe be advisable for future research to use a more qualitative lens to look at the phenomenon of HBCUs being more penalized than PWIs in the field of play. Interviewing HBCU coaches in Division II football to ascertain their observations of what they think is going on in the field of play would be beneficial. That would be a good path to follow for future research, as would be completing observational research in person of HBCU football games to see what types of penalties are being called against HBCUs with the greatest frequency. And while publicly available data on the demographics of Division II referees is not publicly accessible, it would maybe be beneficial to go down that road as well and try to ascertain more information about who the referees are, their demographic background, and the like. In conclusion, the current analysis illustrated that how referees within Division II college football flagged HBCU football teams with more frequency relative to PWI teams on an assortment of different penalty-centric criterion from the 2013-2014 season through the 2019 through the 2020 season. And as alluded to previously, it's difficult to determine the exact reason why a statistical differential was observed, but there are likely multiple factors, including style of play, resources, racial microaggressions, sociocultural factors that could have contributed to the uncovered findings in the study. The words of "upon further review" are often spoken by referees in football games, and it was upon the full review of the publicly available data that this study uncovered a statistical differential between HBCUs and PWIs being penalized on different penalty-centric criteria from the 2013-2014 season through the 2019 through the 2020 season. And thank you for watching this presentation. Have a great day.